Here I've got the shutter from another Zeiss Ikon Ikonta. This is a little wee one, 6 by 4.5 by the looks of it. This one has a Synchro-Compur shutter, but otherwise it's much the same as the Compur Rapid I've just done. So it should come apart in much the same way. 3 screws hold our focus scale ring to the outside of the front group, front element. Front element unscrews. The middle element is nice and greasy and will hopefully come adrift with a friction tool. Let's see if I can clean some of that grease off there first. Otherwise the friction tool will not friction. There's some 2 stop pins here for the focus stop. They may or may not lift off with these front rings. I'm going to try that because I think that where they are placed they're probably vulnerable to damage as I apply a friction tool to that front group. So if the front ring will lift off at this stage with those pins, I would much prefer it. Let's take this front ring off. No, that gets me no closer. Those pins don't appear to be screwed into that plate. Right, friction tool it will be. And the rear group, friction tool there too, I think. The centre of that rear group sticks out quite a long way. I'm concerned that if I put a bar across there to turn it, which is my obvious option, that it would contact the glass. Yeah, friction tool dealt with that nicely. Lifted that off. Now the front group, will it come? I can't get this thing loose with a friction tool, and likewise because of the position of these pins I can't get that hose clip arrangement on here in order to shift that thing. At least I don't think I can. There's just not enough space there. There's a little hole in the mount at this point here, and if you had a circular headed tool with a pin that would drop into that place, you could use that to unscrew the lens from there. Unfortunately I don't have such a tool. What other alternatives do I have? Well, one alternative that works well in a case like this, I'm going to have another go with a friction tool before I move to this, is to file a little groove into the edge of this brass mount and then use a spanner, or in this case just the edge of the rule, to unscrew it from there. It's a multi-start thread. Multi-start threads of course are fun to get the lens screwed back into it. I would need to cut the slot perhaps 1 millimetre deep in order to engage a tool well enough. Decisions. Right, friction tool again first, I think, and then I'll move to more desperate measures. A friction tool proved to be the right tool for the job after all. I just found another size. So we'll undo this lock, rotate that to unhook the bayonet mount, take off our shutter speed cam, and here we have a fairly conventional shutter. This is much like the shutter on a Retina 2A camera and can be dealt with in the same way. So unhook that spring from the main lever, as it's referred to. I'll lift off the shutter release lever, and I noticed that that's got quite a pronounced bend in it at that point, and I don't know whether that's original, so I will be looking closely at that back on the camera to see if that shutter release arm has been bent down slightly. It's always a possibility. And I'm looking at the rest of the shutter to see how it's constructed, see if there's anything unusual about the construction that I need to be aware of. There are no other unusual and exciting components there. It looks very similar to a Retina shutter in a Retina 2A camera. Differs at the flash contact here and probably nowhere else. So I will start stripping it down. If you're going to take apart a shutter like this, you'll need to lay out your components with the appropriate springs and screws. Take lots of photos along the way. So you know where everything came from and can put them back again in the correct position. This is the flash sync components here, which give us our X and M flash sync speeds. I'll unhook that spring. Lift that arm off. Lift out the pallet. A single screw holds the flash contact, the moving flash contact in place. Lift out that along with the acting arm there that fires it. Lift off this cam which runs the pallet. Single screw holds the flash sync contact to the mechanism plate, the fixed contact. See if that'll lift out. It lifts out of the body without a fight. That's always a bonus, because that's not always the case. From the front of the shutter, that's all that needs to come out at this stage. At the rear of the shutter, we have a very miserable screw slot there, which I'll be lucky to get a screwdriver to bite into, but we shall try. That screw head is not very pretty. I think it's been filed after it's been screwed in there, which hasn't left much screw slot, but it's left the head slightly burred over. Let's see if I can get this plate off over there. No, that would be too easy. Let's try again, I might have enough room. No, that screw's going to have to come out all the way. Because the screw's fairly ugly and it's rubbing against the thread on this side. Because the slot is very shallow, the screwdriver doesn't want to engage with it. I will try using a watchmaker's screwdriver, which has quite a sharp tip on the blade. See if that will work. It's not really progressing very well. I'll turn that around slightly so I can get to it, and I'm going to file that slot wider with a jeweler's file that's made for cutting screw slots. Hopefully I can get that slot improved to the point where a screwdriver will grip it better. That'll do it. That's enough. That's good. That screw is really, the diameter of that screw is too wide for the job it's doing there. It's right up against the thread here. We can take that plate off. Aperture setting here, we have a single screw at this point, holds this chrome lever, that lifts off, and we have the shutter body itself. Nothing unusual looking here. 3 screws at the back hold the shutter case and the mechanism plate together. Those 3 screws are identical. And see if I can split the case now. That should come apart, but it's a bit reluctant. I'm going to pop one of those screws back in, get it started on the thread, then give it a push. That's pushed the mechanism plate out of the case slightly. I'll do the same at another one. It's reluctant to fall out, I don't know why. Perhaps some distortion in the case. It's coming out now. Alright. So here's our mechanism plate, 5 blades. Nothing unusual there. So what have we got? The blades should be laid out in number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5. So the blades are laid out in the normal positions, nothing unusual there. It means it's been serviced by someone who knew what they were about. Let's have a look at the case and the diaphragm mechanism. That moves quite smoothly. There's a little bit of drag there, nothing untoward, and if that wasn't serviced it would probably not cause any problem. It's going to be serviced regardless because that's what I'm here to do. The blades look quite clean. We can remove this arm here, the setting lever. There are two screw heads visible through these holes in the plate. I'll back those screws off. The setting lever falls away at the back of the shutter. Tip that over and recover my two screws. Three screws hold the retainer plate in place. One of them is a countersunk head screw, the other two are plain, and there we have it apart. The diaphragm blades, like most of these shutters, the rivet that forms the pivot at one end of the blade is closer to the centre of the blade at one end than it is at the other. At one end it's right by the corner, so the blades are not symmetrical. These are solid plain blades. You may have seen an earlier shutter I showed where there was a big notch in the back. That certainly can complicate things regarding reassembling the shutter or making the blades more vulnerable to damage while you're trying to clean them than these blades here, which are a little bit more solid. This all looks good. The case looks quite good. It's a bit dirty, nothing too dramatic. That'll certainly need cleaning. The shutter's in quite reasonable order in this camera. The mechanism plate. The mechanism plate here, 5 blades. The blades are all identical with the exception of the first blade, which has an extra hole in it. And the extra hole is simply there to identify the first blade, serves no other function, and the blade is otherwise identical to the other 4. So why that's the case, that's one of life's mysteries. If you figure out the answer, you can let me know. The mechanism plate itself. Well, we can unhook the return spring from the little lever here. This lever moves the blade actuating ring, the ring that shifts the blades. In this case, we have a screw that holds that in position. There's a very thin shim washer under that screw, and then the little arm itself. A shim washer like that is fitted on some, but by no means all shutters. It was there obviously to take up some variation in manufacturing. If it's present, put it back. If it's not present, don't worry about it. We have 4 screws hold the retaining ring to the mechanism plate. I would expect to find 3 short screws and 1 long screw. The screws are sometimes hard to remove. They are often held in place with Loctite or some ancestor of Loctite. Three short screws, they're all the same length. Yes, appear to be. This one here is probably a long screw. Yes, it was. To mark where the long screw came from, save you having to figure it out later. Take off the retaining plate, take off the blade actuating ring, and we're down to the mechanism plate. The mechanism plate looks reasonably clean. I'm just going to check the state of the retard gear train. That certainly runs reasonably well, so I don't expect that'll require much in the way of cleaning to work very well indeed. That all looks good. That can all be cleaned. I'll pop that to one side. I start the cleanup really with the shutter case. The other components for the diaphragm and the blades for the diaphragm, of course, all need to be cleaned. Once they're cleaned, I usually reassemble the diaphragm into the case, get that part out of the way, turn my attention to the mechanism plate, clean and reassemble those components on the bottom of the mechanism plate. That's the blade actuating ring and the lever that operates it at the top. And once they're done, clean the shutter blades and then marry the mechanism plate and the shutter case together, and after that reassemble the shutter from the top, which means installing all the control gear on the top of the mechanism plate. So that's my task. So I'm going to start the cleanup process, and the cleanup process has probably been seen a million times and it's fairly straightforward. It just involves using cotton buds or Q-tips and cigarette lighter fluid, naphtha, and carefully cleaning all the components. The components that require the most care would be the diaphragm blades. Because of the rivets on those blades that form the pivots at each end, they are vulnerable to damage. It's easy to catch a cotton bud on them when you're cleaning the surface. You have to be very careful not to do so. If you bend these blades so they no longer lie flat, that doesn't mean that the camera is ruined. It does mean that it's going to be difficult to reassemble the diaphragm. So take care not to overstress these when you're cleaning them and bending them up. I'll bring you back when I've got the components cleaned, and then I can reassemble the shutter and show you how that's done.